Thanks so much. This symposium has been really fantastic to see so many different ways of how people are approaching modeling the mind. I'm going to bring us back to the visual system and tie in with some of the talks we've heard earlier. So when we look out at the world, our cognitive systems impose high-level interpretations of what's out there, that there are scenes, and there are objects, and there are people performing actions on those objects in those scenes. And of course, what we're perceiving is our mental model of the visual world. We're seeing what's inside our head because light is hitting our eyes. We're not shooting rays out from our eyes. And it's maybe not the visual world, it's maybe these are mental models of the physical world that we're getting through visual data. And of course, under the hood, this is coming in through patterns of light hitting the retina. So the questions of my work are to try and understand how do you turn something like this into meaningful representations of the world. And the story starts with a hierarchy of visual areas. So we know visual information gets relayed through the thalamus and gets processed along a series of areas along the ventral stream. These are often modeled with deep nets, which we've heard a lot about, which also have this sort of series of layers that extract increasingly complex features. And so there's been a lot of focus on hierarchy, on how information changes as you go from posterior to anterior, that you are sensitive to low-level feature information like this, and then sub-mid-level shape information en route to higher-level representations of what things look like and what things are. But today, I'm going to argue that instead of focusing on layers and areas and hierarchy, there's a lot of extra information to be gained by taking an orthogonal view and looking about not how information changes this way, but how information changes this way across the cortex. So how does information get routed across these layers? And one of the reasons why I think this is useful is because biological brains have systematic topography. The tuning properties of one neuron are meaningfully related to the tuning properties of the neurons nearby. They're not randomly distributed. You can see that with clustered selectivity of phase-selective neurons. And one of the reasons why we think this is true is because there's wiring limits. You can't just connect every region to every other region. And so where you put things matters. And so we maybe can infer something about the function from the topography. And generally, the spatial organization of our various sensory areas and cortex in between is highly preserved. And topography, or this concept and constraint, is largely absent from deep nets. But I'm going to argue that it's a critical component to understanding information readout from the visual system. So the plan for the talk is to spend the bulk of it on the organization of object responses and this orthogonal view of the visual hierarchy, and then a shorter part on thinking about brain behavior correlations and a highly speculative story about maps and readout. So ventral stream responses to objects. You put a person in the scanner, you have them lie there very still, you show them a bunch of pictures of objects versus just staring at a fixation, and you can see much of the ventral stream is activated. So this is a partially inflated view of a human brain from the side. And if you rotate it like this, now you're looking at the underneath, that's the ventral view. I'll be showing brains in this configuration all the way through. So this part here is the ventral stream. And we know it's responsive to objects, but how is this content organized? What is it about objects that's making some parts of it go? So an old view for a while, what we knew about it was this sort of raisins and oatmeal model. That was actually from a textbook. And so there was, so there are these category selective regions for special categories, faces, bodies, and scenes. They have this sort of interesting mosaic across the ventral stream. But there was no such region for cars and shoes. Instead, you can look at the pattern activity across the whole ventral stream and just tell apart different objects, but there's no large-scale clustering for these other ones. So for a while, it was that there's category selective regions, and everything else must be in finer grained patterns because object space is just too high dimensional. But in thinking about how you might parameterize all of the other objects, one thing that hadn't been tested before was thinking about the fact that ultimately these objects are physical entities in the world. And so they all have a real world size, from small things that you can hold in your hand and manipulate to bigger things you can sit in and navigate around. And so they have different shape statistics, they have different behavioral needs. So for either of these reasons or both, you might imagine that there's a neural division of labor where you might process some small objects in one part and big objects in another part. So we tested this and indeed found when you show pictures of big objects versus small objects, these are presented at the same size on the screen. This is just the size of the objects in the world. You can see there's cortex here that prefers big objects to small, and then here this prefers small to big, and then it's mirrored on the ventral surface, small, big. So there's a real world, there's a organization of object responses by real world size. Another important distinction of objects is between animate and inanimate objects. And this has been shown both in patient studies, so lesions can leave one domain spared while impairing the other and vice versa. Children show very early sensitivity to whether something is likely to be an agent or not. We know that this is true in the patterns. So there should be a large-scale organization by animacy, and if we also know there's one by size, how should these go together? So intuitively, you can divide all the things into animate and inanimate, and you could separately divide those into big and small. And so if we know our size organization looks like this, then we should map our animacy organization like this, nicely preserving this two-dimensional space under the two-dimensional cortex. This is not what happened. After many kinds of analyses, we figured out that there is a tripartite organization where size only matters for inanimate objects, and it's organized like so. So there's this cortex here that responds more to big objects than the other conditions. This cortex here responds more to pictures of animals, independent of their size, more than both big and small objects. Here we have a small object preferring region, and then again you see it's mirrored. So we have another animal preferring region and another big object preferring region. And interestingly, if you go back to the category mosaic, where you can see these face and body selective regions that weren't easily, their spatial location was consistent but not easily understood. In fact, they fall pretty meaningfully with respect to all these other objects that we didn't understand their organization before. So face and body regions fall nicely in this zone that's the surrounding cortex seems to have a stronger preference to other animals, scene regions and big object regions. So there's sort of a nice consistency between the category mosaic and the responses around it. So one question that we had was, and really that everyone asked us, are these really about size and animacy? Really? That's a lot of cortex for size. Does that even make sense as a hypothesis? And this is generally a challenge for interpreting neural responses to real-world objects, whether it's fMRI or electrophysiology, which is, say you measure some response in some region, and it cares more about big objects than small objects. Why? Is it about their size in some abstract way? Or maybe there are differences in the shapes of big objects versus small objects, or the textures, or maybe higher level things like where they're found, or what they're used for. And the real trick of it is that we might imagine different answers might be applying at different spots. So back here, there may be reflecting low-level kind of properties, something mid-level, and then more high-level as you move anterior. And you just can't really isolate these because it's hard to separate those out when you have the full recognizable image. And because it's so tricky, there have been some people who said, most of this is high level. Others who've been arguing that most of it is extremely low level. A lot of people thinking much of it is probably mid-level, but we haven't had a great model of mid-level vision to really test this. And so to get at this, we created this new stimulus class, which we call text forms. And by we created this, I actually mean a really brilliant graduate student, Bria Long, created these. And she's a postdoc now at Stanford and is on the job market soon, and I highly recommend that you look into her. So in order to really show you these stimuli, I'm just going to have you do the task that people did in the scanner. So I want you to stare at these images. I want you to clap if there's a repeat, and of course, keep your heads very still. Here we go. Nice, someone had ESP there. But... Good, very good. Any idea what you saw? Excellent. Here's what you saw. We didn't tell our subjects this, but these are in the exact same order, but now they're original recognizable versions. Also keep doing the task. You're still in this experiment, yes. Very good. You haven't fallen asleep. Excellent. So these are text forms. We make them by taking original image and running it through a texture synthesis algorithm modified from Freeman and Simoncelli's model. And we basically call them text forms mostly just because by eye they seem to preserve some texture and coarse form information about the original images, which are here. So now, with the stimuli, which are no longer recognizable, but still preserve something about the shape and texture of these objects, we can ask, how do text forms drive the ventral visual stream? And we had very clear predictions. So we have our activations, and there's something exciting about these sort of elongated zones that go from posterior to anterior. And maybe each of these are little mini hierarchies for each of the different kinds of content. And so if we show our text forms, maybe we'll drive differences that are related to mid-level statistical differences here, but you won't see activations in the more anterior regions because we're lacking all the high-level content and lots of mid-level content too. These don't even have contours. This is also not what we found. So first I will show you the results for the original recognizable images, big objects, animals, and small objects. So this is a replication of what we had found before. So you can be big, animate, small, animate, big. And here are the activations with text forms. So by eye, you can see that there is very similar activation despite very different high-level content. So our idea that we would isolate some posterior or intermediate area aspect of the ventral visual stream was wrong. So now we've revised our hypothesis, and now we think maybe there's a really extensive mid-level feature bank that basically encompasses all of occipitotemporal cortex. We did a bunch of additional questions in this study. I'm just going to highlight a few. We really try to see, is there any evidence for a hierarchy? So we took occipitotemporal cortex and divided it into sections and looked to see for each voxel how strong is its preference for either an animal or an object. So you can see for originals, there's a reasonable strong preference all the way along the hierarchy from posterior to anterior. And what we were expecting for text forms was something like, matched and then really dropping off as you got more anteriorly. And here are the data. They're weaker, but everywhere. And same thing when you looked at big objects versus small objects. And so these data showed that original images basically just have a stronger response preference uniformly across the ventral stream. Could this just be about low-level features or retinopathies? That's the other side of the camp. It's just all retinopathy and low-level features. So one way we got around this is to run another experiment where we presented the text forms in either upper or lower quadrant, and then we looked for responses that held their animacy or size preference in both locations. So we again see the same patterns for originals and text forms. And then we wanted to get a sense of what are those features really? What is it that lets us tell apart small objects from animals, from big objects? And we still don't have a great answer to that, but I'll tell you what we figured out so far. And the way we did that was to run things through a deep net. So we took an AlexNet architecture and we trained it to do object recognition. So it can take in a bunch of images and it can classify from among 1,000 categories what's in there. And then we showed it text forms. It thinks text forms are plastic bags. Nonetheless, you can measure responses in each of the neurons and try and predict the neural responses to text forms. And what you can see is by intermediate and then to late layers, we're predicting very well the responses to text forms within a noise ceiling, which is about how one subject's brain predicts another. saying, oh, layer 4, 5, and 6, that's the level of features, is satisfying to some, but not to others. And so we had this sense that curvature really mattered. Small objects are curvy because they're handheld, and big objects tend to be boxier and have extended surfaces because they have to withstand gravity. And these are physical reasons why shape statistics might covary with size. And so we put a text form up on the screen, and we had people rate, is this very boxy or very curvy on a scale from 1 to 5? That one-dimensional vector also predicted neural responses pretty well. And so our conclusion so far is that the kinds of features that are represented here are curvy, boxy features of intermediate complexity. So to summarize this part, I've shown you there's a tripartite organization by these high-level dimensions of animacy and size. But it's mid-level features that are really explaining the response properties. So do I contradict myself? Is this about high-level information, or is it about mid-level shape? And what happened to the visual hierarchy? So to get an intuition about how to think about this comes down to thinking about what neural regions do. What do we think neural regions should do? And one way of thinking about it is that neural regions isolate levels. You have V1, and then you go to V2, which gives you a different level, and then V3, and you have these sort of progressive stages that are isolating different levels of representation. And on that model, we design these beautifully controlled stimulus sets to try and control for shape to isolate category. And that idea is that there's maybe some cortex here that's really caring about shape, and other cortex that's really caring about category, and it's possible to break these with the right stimuli. But actually, in thinking through this, there may be a deep flaw in the logic because you've like untethered something from how the input gets in. And so another way of thinking about it, that's another model that we think of what neural regions do, is that they capture covariance. And in the world, the shape of things and the category of things are intrinsically correlated. And so, for instance, big objects may be a little boxier, and small objects rounder, and animate objects blobbier. And so, there's meaningful relationships between the category of things and the shape of things. And actually, it's a little worse than this. So there are even lower level correlations as well. So big objects tend to also have more high spatial frequency and tend to be experienced more in the periphery. Whereas small objects tend to have more low spatial frequency content and tend to be experienced more centrally. I mean, to think about making this as big as, say, a scene, I'd have to like hold it up to one eye, right? So most of the time, just in the distributions of how we interact and view objects of different sizes in the world, there are just natural different input kinds of statistics, both in low-level features, and mid-level features, and high-level features, and even in non-visual features. So the big objects tend to be more useful for orienting, small objects you want to grasp, and animate things you might socialize with. And interestingly enough, there's independent evidence from many different groups looking at the perihippocampal place area that finds evidence for each of these layers, each of these levels of representation independently. So the same region of cortex, PPA, cares about high spatial frequency more than low, peripheral more than central, boxy more than curvy, rectilinear more than round, big more than small, and objects that appear at navigationally relevant intersections more than objects not at navigationally relevant intersections, the same cortex. And so what this is revealing is there are a lot of correlated features between low-level kinds of information all the way up to high-level kinds of information. And for the cognitive scientists trying to isolate levels of representation and map them onto the cortex, this has been a major challenge. Like, how do we separate these out? But actually, I think that this covariance between these low and high-level features is a great thing for brains. It actually starts to tell us how it might even be possible to go from low-level inputs up to high-level, meaningful representations of the world around us. So maybe we should look for feature stacks, that is, sets of information that let you channel from low-level to high-level kinds of content, and that span levels of representation, and that maybe these are organized along different content channels for different kinds of things. So this is the idea of content channeling along the ventral stream. So here, there's been a lot of focus on hierarchy going from posterior to anterior, and I've schematized that cortex here. But to our data, it's a blurry gradient at best, and much of this is relatively mid-level. But what's clear as day are the content preferences that run across this hierarchy. Big objects, animals, small objects. So I'll schematize those here. And so this idea here is that we have tuning that's spatially arranged into content channels that map these high-level distinctions topographically across the cortex. So, new questions. Why these channels and why this organization? And there's lots of debate and lots of ideas. And they span from the people who are on the empiricist side and think everything comes from the statistics of the input to people on the nativist side who think it's all built in. So on the empiricist side and the input side, which I tend to lean this way, in all honesty, though I try and balance it, is that so instead of, here's the visual hierarchy, V1, V2, V3, but there are content channels that run across this cortex as well. So these neurons convey information that's happening in your center of your gaze, these other ones peripheral. And so the idea is just in virtue of the natural image statistics you might get in cortex that's just trying to capture covariance, you might naturally go from central aggregating shape statistics in the center of your visual field that give way to small object and animate preferring representations, and peripheral information that give way to big object representations. And so there's this sort of natural, inherited from retinotopy idea. On the other hand, what we have to do with that information is arguably more important. So maybe there are long-range networks, for instance, that go in and reinforce particular distinctions. So small object regions may connect preferentially to dorsal stream reaching and grasping regions, navigation regions for the big objects, and social networks connected to animate OTC. And in fact, we found evidence for these three networks when we look in resting state structure. So there's an argument there that it's these networks that are enforcing these particular content divisions to be learned in OTC. And a third one that's often overlooked, but if you look in the resting state data, these networks are here, but by far, all of these networks are most correlated with each other at rest, the whole bank. And so maybe there's a shape space, and that there are sort of self-organizing properties that make big objects different from animals, different from small objects. And there's evidence independently for all three of these factors playing a role in the organization. And what I think is beautiful about that is that they're aligned. They all point to the same story, that you can have an input kind of organization making way to a shape organization, connecting with these long-range networks, which we don't just grow willy-nilly. Those are patterned in pretty early. So input formats, output needs, and internal computations probably play a role, but exactly how and when are open questions. And are there more, or are these the only ones? And how do they get to be this way? We don't know. And finally, this is just a map. Are there any consequences of this organization for the mind? I'm not going to answer that in a very deep way, but I will give you beginning bits of evidence that suggest that there are. And that brings us to part 2. Brain behavior correlations and a highly speculative story about maps and readout. So visual behaviors have some constraints. We can't attend to everything at once. We can't instantly find what we're looking for, even if it's right in front of us. So here's visual search. We've heard a lot about this over the past 2 days. If this is your target, you have to find it in this array. You probably found this one right away. But did you notice there were 2 more? This one. So something about the relationship between the targets and distractors help you find it faster. And people have spent a lot of time figuring out what those are. This is a list from a recent review by Jeremy Wolf. I will zoom in on one part and highlight just 2 bullets in this long list: shape and curvature, things that have been occupying me for years, are just small bullet points. But if you allow me a gloss over these features, the things that guide search are mostly about the way things look rather than about what they are. And in that way, we can use visual search feeds as a behavioral index of perceptual similarity. And so I will just demonstrate the way we do this with a task. So I want you to look for this object in the next array and clap when you see it. Everyone ready? Okay, here we go. Very good. Next try. Interesting. My demo didn't work. That one was supposed to be a little harder, right? But I feel like you guys were primed. I didn't factor in training, practice effects, yes. Okay, so what you might not have... Good. So the first display here was a big object among small object distractors. The second display was a big target among big object distractors. And what we find is that people are faster to find this target when there's a mixed display than when there's a uniform display. And so this isn't just when you use recognizable images, this also holds when you do the text forms. And this isn't just for size, it's also for animacy. And so what this lets us argue from behavior is that big objects as a class are perceptually distinct from small objects as a class, and vice versa, and same for animate and inanimate, which is suggestively consistent with the neural organization. But can we test this more directly? So we did this in a series of projects led by Michael Cohen, where we tried to directly relate visual search similarity to the neural organization. So what we did was we measured visual search similarity among 8 categories. So how fast can you find a face among hammers, a face among phones, a hammer among bodies? We did all the 28 pairings, and we measured reaction time. Then we measured brain responses to each category separately in different participants while they did a one-back task. And what we can measure is, in those participants' brains, how similar are the neural patterns to bodies and phones, bodies and hammers. We can do all the pairs. And now we can ask where in the brain, if anywhere, do we see this behavioral similarity emerge in the visual system? And we used representational similarity analysis, thank you, Nico, by simply correlating the behavior with the brain similarity structure. And our approach here was to vary the neural regions to see where the best match was between brains and behavior. So the very first thing we tried was these large-scale sectors to ask, is there a major relationship in these is there a relationship in these major divisions of the visual system? So here, this is ventral occipital temporal cortex here. On the x-axis is how similar any 2 categories are. The y-axis is how long it took you to find one amongst the others. And we found a really high correlation between the similarity of responses evoked by 2 object categories, and how long it took you to find one among the other. And that wasn't just true in ventral occipital-temporal, it was also true in lateral cortex here. We even found it in occipital-parietal cortex. You don't see anything in early visual cortex, and that was in effect by design. We measured responses to faces that varied a lot in pose and viewpoint, and so you can see basically we have a restricted range. All the neural patterns are very similar to early visual cortex. So we found moderate to strong correlations across the ventral and the dorsal stream. Then we did a searchlight analysis, which effectively let us ask, does this relationship that we see require pooling over large-scale regions? Because we know some of those have body selectivity and face selectivity, so maybe you need to pool over this whole thing to really capture that visual search behavior. So we used a smaller radius, and what you can see here is that basically anywhere in the visual system, there's a pretty moderate to strong correlation with visual search, extensively even at this mesoscale. So then we localize the category selective ROIs in each participant to ask, is this really holding in each category selective ROI? So here we have extrastriate body area, fusiform face area, and perihippocampal place area. This is the correlation between responses similarity in FFA to all the different categories and visual search behavior. Same thing with scenes, same thing with bodies. Now, some of these pairs have faces, like a face among hammers and a face among shoes. So we took those out, and we still see the relationship. So the similarity of chairs and shoes and hammers in FFA is related to how long it takes to find them in visual search. You see that same thing in PPA and EDA. So even in category selective regions, even without the preferred categories. This is strange. We didn't discuss this too much in the paper because the implications are, they're confusing, and so they aren't in the paper. So I'm going to summarize where we ended the paper, and then I'm going to tell you what we think is going on. In addition, we didn't just do visual search. We tested a bunch of different tasks. So we also looked at competition and working memory. It's actually easier to remember two faces and two scenes than two faces and two bodies. Masking, how well these mask each other. Categorization. The time it takes you to say that that is not a face is faster. If that were a body, it would take you longer to reject it as a face. And visual search. Basically, across all of these different visual tasks, we found the same relationship to the neural architecture. And so what we concluded is that there seems to be this stable architecture of object representation that's a primary bottleneck for many visual behaviors that's related to the way things look. Okay, let's roll back to that last result. FFA shows this relationship between similarity and search, even without the faces. How can this be? What kind of features must be represented in FFA to make this possible? We thought about it for a very long time. And we looked at the data even more and found a few other puzzling things that help point to an answer. So if you look in FFA and PPA, we know in their univariate response preferences, FFA is space preferring, PPA is building preferring. But if you look at the pattern similarity, so how similar across the voxels are faces to cats and faces to bodies, FFA and PPA have very similar pairwise distance relationships across these categories. So it could have been the case that all the regions were accounting for different parts of the variance of the behavioral search data, but it's not. The regions themselves are surprisingly correlated. So what's going on? I mean, it tells us that preferences are telling us something different than the pattern structure. So here's an idea. Maybe when regions have the same pattern structure or representational geometry, they have a common representational goal. And I think in this case, what makes sense of the data is to distinguish all categories from all other categories simultaneously. So axes are visual features, and the features try and distinguish categories from each other. And so in that case, you're not learning face selective features per se, but you're just trying to separate out faces from bodies, from chairs, from shoes. And those are highly discriminative features and so meaningfully apply to the other categories. And that is, I think, one of the things that are this idea is supported by deep nets, because what are deep net features but features learned in service of trying to solve a 1,000-way categorization at the same time? You have a question? No, 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, so then what are the preferences telling us? Why do they have different responses? And I think that's telling us that these regions have distinct readout. So maybe if we just assert that the brain needs high firing rate to get high fidelity readout. Well, faces are high on some features and low on others, and vice versa for houses. And so maybe we need to sort of rotate this space around so different regions are elaborating different parts of the space in high responses. And so that way different regions can signal different content. And so a big picture putting this together is that we have this high-dimensional shape space that separates all categories from other categories. That's a common representational goal, but we've mapped it to object responsive cortex, where each region is elaborating different parts of this shape space, but it's mapped in such a way to help the wiring problem so that different parts can go in and read out aspects or facets of the shape space without having to listen to the other parts to get different kinds of content. So in that way, a region is simultaneously mid-level in that it participates in this features bank, but high level in that it participates in a particular kind of readout. And it also suggests that maybe animacy and size are the sort of major axes through the shape space. So to summarize, I showed you that there was a tripartite organization of object responses across the occipitotemporal cortex, and put forward a couple ideas. One, that instead of trying to isolate levels of representation, we try and stack them up. And we should organize those according to different kinds of content to enable easier readout. And that this large-scale organization is a perceptual bottleneck for many visual behaviors. And that deep nets may be working so well because they really excel at extracting meaningful covariance. And I think that is also what our visual systems are doing. Thank you very much.